Hi, everyone. So, my name is Francisco Robles. I'm an assistant professor of English, Latinx Studies, and Gender Studies here at Notre Dame. And it's my honor today to introduce Dr. Peter Gatrell, the winner of the 2021 Laura Shannon Prize, sponsored by the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, for his book, The Unsettling of Europe: How Migration Shaped a Continent. If you'll permit me, I'd like to take the time to sketch Gatrell's importance to a number of fields in this introduction, and how his work anchors our conference. Before that, though, I'd like to thank Clemens Sedmak, Mel Webb, Becca Prince, Grant Osborne, and Grania McAvoy. Thank you especially to Mel, Becca, and Grant. Our many meetings over the past year have made this collaboration a truly intellectual endeavor. You've helped make the Signature Conference a strong contribution to the Nanovic Institute's strategic plan until 2026, engaging big questions and peripheries in Europe. It's hard to find a more widely interesting and interested historian of migration and political economy in Europe than Dr. Peter Gatrell, whose work spans centuries of global processes and national formations. Currently a professor emeritus of history at the University of Manchester, and incorporating economic history, military history, refugee studies, regional studies, Russian history, and migration studies. Gatrell's work is remarkably expansive and erudite. Also, notice if you read Unsettling Europe, you'll find a reference to Zahia Rahmani, last night's keynote speaker, uh, as well. His first book, The Tsarist Economy, 1850 to 1917, was published in 1986. His next book, 1994's Government, Industry, and Rearmament in Russia, 1900 to 1914, The Last Argument of Tsarism, continued his work in political economy by showing its inflection in and through military history. In 1999, his next monograph, A Whole Empire Walking, Refugees in Russia During the First World War, and preceded by book chapters on the topic, initiates an enduring interest in migrants and refugees, especially as they constitute and raise questions about European history, about space, identity, and belonging. In works such as Free World, The Campaign to Save the World's Refugees, The Making of the Modern Refugee, and The Unsettling of Europe, How Migration Shaped a Continent, Gatrell's thought has expansively and sensitively outlined the contexts of human movement in ways that have unsettled assumptions about sending and receiving nations, about push and pull factors, about centers and peripheries. In Unsettling Europe, Gatrell notes the long history of European migration in the Constitution of Europe, particularly in relation to global war, colonization, and decolonization. Migration emerges as a result of highly variable economic and political situations and desires. For example, one thing you'll learn from the book is in the immediate post-war system, migration was a force of homogenization. People were expelled to their ethnic origins. So this produces a really interesting problem. How do we think about migration given that it's both used as a homogenizing, but also as a multicultural process? Part of this for Gatrell is expulsion, which is a distinct process from exclusion. To create migrants through expulsion is related but distinct from exclusion. And indeed, Gatrell's extraordinarily granular work, as he builds his epic overview of post-war migration in Europe, attends deftly to all of these nuances, noting the highly regional and specific character of migration policies. In these spaces of expulsion, the policing of European political, social, and racial borders takes on the character of biopolitical determination, becoming a matter of sovereignty rather than human rights. In this sense, making distinctions of sovereign power becomes more important than the protection of human rights, such that states abjure responsibilities to migrants and refugees in these zones. As Dr. Gatrell points out, non-EU states have been offered EU funds to establish detention centers that have kept refugees and migrants out of the European spotlight and exposed them to degradation and abuse. In this way, for example, the Mediterranean Sea has become a dangerous space of manufactured vulnerability. Even, one could argue, and this has been argued today, a graveyard of sorts. Migrants seeking passage into Europe are often left to their own devices by national navies and coast guards, even if they're in great peril, as we've heard about today. The abrogation of responsibility in terms of human rights is disturbing, and Gatrell's careful attention to migration helps us understand how sovereignty, ethnic selfhood, nationalism, infrastructural rebuilding, and economic development, as well as economic protection, have all been gradually articulated as a national or continental right to refuse rights, to withhold the defense of human rights when it comes to certain people. Yet, as he points out, migration in Europe shows various strands of mobility, such that migration speaks of interrupted journeys, and travel between different destinations. It acknowledges that migrants are often that migrants may have at stake more than one place simultaneously. People's motives are often difficult to disentangle in any straightforward way, he argues, and migration can make a mockery of attempts to draw a clear distinction between them. For this reason, I find that Gatrell makes a forceful case for care and radical hospitality, an argument he elaborated in 2022 in the pages of the New York Times in relation to the invasion of Ukraine. He asks us a series of questions at the end of that op-ed. Can Europe's leaders, so long at odds over the question of migration, be persuaded to enlarge their responsibility to safeguard the lives of people who flee violence, no matter where they come from? Could the current crisis in Ukraine actually be a catalyst for substantially improving the rights of refugees around the world? For Gatrell, attending to the complex history of migration means imagining radical, utopian futures around care. He wonders in the New York Times if this might be naive, but it isn't. It's brave. And thank you for this intellectual vision, and welcome to the University of Notre Dame, Dr. Gatrell.
I think I'd rather carry on listening to Francisco than giving my talk, partly because he does a masterful job of summarizing some of the things I've tried to do over the last 2 or 3 decades. Of course, I should begin, as everyone has done who's presented from this podium, by thanking the Nanovich Institute. I keep thinking of it's Nanovich, but I know it's Nanovic, okay. The Nanovic Institute, its faculty and its staff. If I echo the remarks that have been made already, it's not because it's formulaic, it's a genuine sentiment of gratitude towards the faculty and staff. And I also want to thank the conference organizers and indeed the presenters so far, because I wrote a paper, and you'll hear the paper, but the emphasis on you will hear the paper. But I also feel that the paper in some ways engages with the other presentations I've heard, including the keynotes. So there's a kind of, I like to think of this paper as still a work in progress, just because it exists in a typewritten form. And it's a work in progress, partly because you read and reflect as an individual, but also because, and I think this very strongly, you encounter the work of others and their perspectives, and that is incredibly important. Those of you who were here at the previous session will have heard a question and some responses in relation to the question of should we be optimistic or should we be pessimistic. And I thought, well, okay, my paper's 99% pessimistic. And then I thought, well, that's not true, because offsetting a degree of pessimism is also the optimism that comes partly from the acknowledgement that there are activists out there, people who resist, people who campaign for a better world. But also, if I can, as it were, embarrass the speakers in this conference, because of the work that you do. Because that in itself, the scholarship, the reflections, are themselves powerful forms of intervention. And I think that tips the balance a little bit in the favor of optimism rather than pessimism. And now Francisco was very kind to remind me what I wrote in my book. And I can't possibly try and summarize or go through the different elements in that book, but it might be of interest to know how it came about that someone who started his career writing about, with a PhD on the Tsarist armaments industry, ends up writing a book about the unsettling of Europe. And as he said, it's partly because back in the late 1990s, I had some generous leave to write a book about Russia during the First World War. And what happened was that I decided fairly early on that I needed to write a paragraph or two about a group of people that kept cropping up in the Soviet literature on the subject, and that was refugees. Now, Soviet historians wrote quite formulaic work very often. I mean, high quality, but nevertheless kind of formulaic. And they would talk about the changes in the labour market in Russia during the First World War and the way in which women were mobilised and prisoners of war were mobilised to work for the war economy. Oh, and then there were some refugees. And that was it. You know, there were some numbers. Soviet historians loved their numbers. But they didn't really probe the question about who were these people? Why were they there? What were they doing? What did they think? What became of them? So I ended up, you know, what was originally conceived of as a paragraph or a few pages became a book. And then I started to teach the subject of refugee history and got interested in questions not just in relation to Russia, but to other parts of the world. And then in 2015 or 2016, I got approached by Penguin Press in the UK, who said, we want someone to write a book about immigration to Britain. Would you be interested? And I said, I know nothing about immigration to Britain, but I would like to write a book about migration in Europe, because it seemed to me there was an important story, a countervailing story to tell about Europe as a continent of migration, of people on the move across frontiers, but also internally. And I emphasized that I wanted to do it about East and West, rather than, heaven forbid, talk about Britain alone. There is a chapter in the book on the UK, but slightly mischievously, I called it Migration in the European Periphery. So anyway, in this paper, what I want to try and do is to think of some of the ways in which hitherto marginal or neglected sites and histories become salient as a result of migration. And I shall make some references to what's happening in Ukraine. But everyone in this room will be familiar with the representation of migration from beyond Europe, not just as a problem. You'll have to insert the scare quotes yourselves, not just as a problem to be managed, but as a full-blown crisis. And it's worth pointing out that this is largely a presentist discourse. But history, at least a particular reading of the past, has been marshalled in support of restrictionist measures. In the UK, for example, politicians of all stripes regularly repeat the mantra that Britain has, quote, a proud tradition of welcome. I mean, I wish I had a pound for every time I heard that on the news. But that myth is rarely subject to close and informed scrutiny. It serves, however, to validate a refusal to do more, as if the obligation to provide a place of safety has already been discharged. So you can find this discourse in the 1930s with restrictionist measures in relation to Jews from East and Central Europe. You find it in World Refugee Year in 1959 to 60, about which I wrote another book. And now, across the political spectrum, the proud tradition of welcome is a way of refusal to get more closely involved. Nor is it just the recent past that is evoked. Populist politicians in Europe, from Boris Johnson to Viktor Orban, have recycled stories of barbarian invasions and the fall of the Roman Empire to dramatize the apocalyptic consequences of unrestrained migration. Their febrile imagination translates into policy making which inevitably has real consequences for the lives of people on the move. The assumption behind their remarks is that there is a kind of European core that needs to be defended against those in and from the non-core. Sometimes that core is assumed to embody a broad set of values, neatly expressed by the Deputy Executive Director of Frontex, who tweeted on the 19th of April, 2023, "We seek to secure not only borders, but also the essence of our European identity values, values of freedom, democracy, and the rule of law." Sometimes the core is defined more explicitly in terms of race, especially on the far right. And relatedly, the populist stance derives from a belief that cross-border migration, especially from the global south, threatens what's presumed to be a stable national identity. But this discursive shift goes hand in hand with the pretense that migration is unrelated to Europe's long history of colonization and decolonization. And I think there is an extraordinary amount of work that needs to be done, for example, in the school curriculum. I can't speak for the United States, but certainly for the United Kingdom, to actually hammer home the point that migration has a history and it isn't unrelated to European colonization and decolonization. Instead, mass media outlets endlessly recycle images of boatloads of people who are portrayed in anthropologist Lisa Malky's famous formulation as speechless and dehistoricized. And also, little attention is paid to economic changes in countries where EU policies have contributed directly to local impoverishment. I'm reading an article just a day or two ago about the Senegalese fishing industry, where European industrial scale fishing fleets have decimated the local marine life. And Senegalese fishermen are looking for ways of finding a way of making a living, and migration is one route. And it ties also with what Zahir Rahmani was talking about yesterday, about the eucalyptus planting by Europe and how it devastated the economy of North Africa. Instead of thinking seriously about the implications of policy, or indeed about history, politicians turn their ire on people smugglers and portray asylum seekers as helpless dupes who hand over large sums of money to embark on hazardous sea crossings. No matter that in decades past, those who helped Cold War escapees to cross the Iron Curtain, or who led Spanish Republicans over the Pyrenees to France to flee Franco's regime, were regarded as heroes. But the amnesia and refusal to acknowledge the history of rescue, this is deliberate, because those smugglers and the intrepid refugees they helped were white. Now, those who seek safety and opportunity by venturing determinedly beyond the periphery to the core are held at arm's length. That doesn't prevent governments and EU spokespersons from maintaining that Europe is not a fortress but a filter, and that restrictive measures need not deter those deemed by the state to be genuine refugees, nor stand in the way of schemes of organized migration, as if there's a tap that can be turned on and off at will. Now, deterrent and punitive measures are adapted to identify overstayers and other illegal migrants or bogus asylum seekers, categories that seem capable of being made more and more elastic. So European politicians who bicker over migration and asylum are agreed on the need to shift responsibility for managing asylum claims to the European periphery, such as by asking Turkey to hold on to Syrian refugees. And these measures go back some way. Early in the new millennium, the UK government under Tony Blair recommended that applications for asylum should be processed outside the EU, such as in Turkey and Iran, in the case of Iraqi asylum seekers, denying them the opportunity to apply on entry and lodge asylum claims in the UK. The government also reached an agreement with the Czech government to station UK immigration officers at Prague airport to screen Roma asylum seekers who intended to travel to Britain. These proposals gained traction as EU member states found attractive the idea of externalizing responsibility for scrutinizing claims by asylum seekers. Subsequently, Frontex played a key role in negotiating agreements with non-EU countries, such as Albania, Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, offering EU funds to establish detention centres. And we heard a little bit about that just now in the previous session. These centres keep refugees and migrants well out of the spotlight. They exposed and continue to expose migrants to degradation and abuse, particularly in Libya. Externalization begs the question, where is Europe now? But I think we need to consider other aspects of the relationship between migration and European politics. The stance adopted by Viktor Orban, for example, is related to broader politics of demography. In recent years, the Hungarian government has actively encouraged Hungarians to return to the mother country and simultaneously sought to deter young Hungarians from emigrating by portraying the West as decadent, although many of those young people presumably relish the prospect of that decadence. Governments in Hungary as well as Poland have adopted measures to increase the birth rate, but local firms remain short of workers. Some immigration is therefore imperative, albeit conditional. As Ivan Krastev puts it, migrants, so long as they do not come from Muslim countries, can live and, more importantly, work inside the walls of the city, but will not be allowed to set foot in City Hall. But in the light of restrictive measures adopted by the UK, for example, we should be careful not to create a crude and false dichotomy between an illiberal East Europe and a liberal Western Europe, a trope that's reminiscent of Enlightenment characterizations of Eastern Europe as non-civilized, the subject of a classic study by Larry Wolff, Inventing Eastern Europe. Whatever the specific politics in Hungary or elsewhere, in what Donald Rumsfeld famously called New Europe, Viktor Orban's stance echoes demographic and racist anxieties elsewhere and at other times, finding their most insidious expression today in the warped notion of a great replacement, which recognizes no borders. So to sum up so far, migration speaks to the mutability of Europe and a shift in the collective understanding of where and what is meant by Europe and the component elements. The externalization of asylum has relocated it to what Etienne Balibar has called the South Mediterranean fence. This stage management represents considerable foreign aid and investment. It keeps migrants at arm's length, portrays them as abject or aggressive people. They are intermittently exposed to public gaze, whether readers of newspapers in Budapest or Birmingham, or sun-seeking tourists in Greece, Italy, or Malta, but are primarily people without history. In this way, the counterpart to the utopia of closer European integration and freedom of movement within the EU is the dystopia of invasion and the need for control. Now, recent developments in Europe indicate how migration is an integral part of the political battleground, and how ostensibly peripheral sites can suddenly acquire political salience. Although historians are now less enamored of the center-periphery model as it applied to world systems approaches, nevertheless, it seems to retain its geopolitical resonance. I want to develop this argument by talking about Ukraine, current developments as well as aspects of its history. The underlying geopolitical hierarchy, with a senior or dominant state and a subordinate neighbor, is clearly expressed in the rhetoric that accompanies the ongoing Russian war against Ukraine. Putin has explicitly stated that Ukraine is a small nation whose history exists only as an appendage to Russia. Recall that in Tsarist times, Ukraine was officially designated Little Russia. But Putin's dismissal of Ukraine as peripheral, Ukraine literally means on the edge, Ukraine, Kraina is the extreme, Kraini is extreme. It literally means on the edge, corresponds to what has been called a lack of historiographical legitimacy. By this I mean Ukraine has attracted scant attention from scholars and politicians in the West, notwithstanding the efforts of the diaspora to keep disasters such as the Stalin-era famine, the Holodomor, in the public eye. And often overlooked in the literature on the displacement caused by the Russian invasion is the long history of migration in and from Ukraine. In addition to internal migration and urbanization in the 19th and 20th centuries, mass displacement resulted from war, revolution, and civil war in 1914 to 21, including a brief and violent period of German occupation of Ukraine and Ukrainian independence. Further upheavals followed Stalinist collectivization and famine in the early 1930s. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 enabled the occupiers to deport Ukrainian and other civilians to Germany as forced laborers. And the Allied victory in 1945 exposed the presence of these so-called displaced persons, DPs, in Germany and Austria at the war's end. As it embarked on post-war reconstruction, the Soviet Union badly needed to replenish its loss of manpower and therefore demanded the repatriation of these DPs, including to Soviet Ukraine. And Western European economies likewise sought out additional sources of labour, but they were deliberately selective. Baltic displaced persons, Baltic DPs, were much preferred, followed by Polish, and Ukrainians were the bottom of the hierarchical pile. Ukrainians who came to Britain as DPs, as European volunteer workers, were assigned to the most arduous occupations. When more refugees arrived in the West in the late 1940s to escape Soviet communism, the global Ukrainian diaspora was replenished. However, even if they kept the flag of independence flying, it remained the case that the history of Ukraine itself remained little known or understood. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 restored Ukrainian independence, but arguably of equal significance was Poland's accession to the EU in 2004, which meant that Ukraine now had a land border with the EU. The implications of this moment were equally profound, particularly for people who had hitherto crossed between Ukraine and Poland with relative ease. Today, of course, the relationship has been upended by the Russian invasion. Putin seeks to protect Russian interests and Russians in Crimea and the Donbass, and by extension elsewhere. He claims to want to save Ukrainian children from Zelensky and the Nazis who support him. His discourse draws not only on a particular reading of Russian and Soviet history, but also on deeply entrenched ideas of the heroic and masculine figure who is simultaneously conqueror and the defender of Russian civilization. But the costs of his military operation include an exodus of educated professionals to neighboring states, exodus of Russian professionals to neighboring states, reminiscent of the departure of Russian refugees in the wake of revolution and civil war in 1917 to 21. This latest exodus augments critical voices in the Russian diaspora, although Putin is surely far more concerned about maintaining support amongst rank and file Russians in Russia, including those in the near abroad, and is much less bothered about those who opted to leave. Meanwhile, the invasion led to a sudden migration and dispersal of refugees from Ukraine, mainly women and children, mainly to Poland and adjacent states. Ukrainians who crossed into Poland now needed only to show a passport to gain admittance. Ultimately, the dissolution of the Soviet Union was a version of European decolonization, and the tempestuous upheavals that resulted, including the mass movements of people from former colonies, what has been called the reflux or repatriation, to Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, Britain, France, Portugal. One obvious point to make is that there would be no return or post-colonial migration without colonization in the first place. It's also important to stress that the grip on colonial possessions only loosened as a result of armed struggle by national liberation movements. In the Dutch East Indies, in East Africa, in France, these struggles led to the incarceration and displacement, not just of fighters, but of entire families. Algeria is the obvious example, but the same was true of Indonesia and Kenya. Decolonization had massive domestic, social, and demographic consequences that continue to reverberate. Strictly speaking, the chronology differed according to which colonial power is being examined. Italy's long decolonization belongs to the 1940s, whereas the end of Portuguese rule in Angola and Mozambique coincided with the Salazar regime's end in 1974. But in all cases, the departing colonial powers arranged for the urgent evacuation of colonial officials and white settlers, as well as indigenous actors who had supported imperial rule on behalf of Italy, the Netherlands, and other colonial powers. The dissolution of colonial ties propelled different groups of migrants either back home, in inverted commas, or to other destinations where they hoped to resurrect their former lifestyle. In the short term, many of them encountered indifference or contempt, notwithstanding the fact that, as in Italy, they were regarded as national refugees. So to take one example, military veterans who defended the Dutch East Indies against the liberation movement were unceremoniously shipped back to the Netherlands, where they complained of being treated like DPs and refugees. As in other instances, the retreating colonial power made no advanced preparation to accommodate these invisible migrants. And I have a section which I won't read out, but I mean the history of the Pieds Noirs arriving suddenly, I mean, virtually overnight from Algeria to France, to the Hexagon, created immense difficulties, and not just for French officials, but above all for the Pieds Noirs themselves, who struggled to cope with the lack of provision. What was impressive, I think, is the degree to which self-help initiatives helped them to negotiate the new circumstances, along with the activities of local charities, church groups, and some local residents. Anyway, the point I wish to make is that the French state and French public opinion struggled to come to terms with their presence and with their status. Were they repatriates? Were they people in retreat? And therefore the embodiment of a defeated France? Were they refugees? Might they even, as some people said, be bandits who posed a terrorist threat to France, the country that unceremoniously abandoned them to their fate? Were they, as one dismissive report suggested, merely holidaymakers? Newspapers described families who were desperate to flee, but who also held out the possibility, a forlorn hope, as it turned out, that they might even return to Algeria. Meanwhile, although a kind of decolonization took place in the former Soviet Union, it garnered little attention because it was largely contained within post-Soviet space. But it nevertheless had profound consequences for domestic Russian politics and for the people most directly affected by the dissolution of the Soviet Union. These returnees faced a difficult future. They had to adjust to the loss of their privileges, and the host society, in turn, often regarded them as competitors for resources and as the embodiment of defeat and humiliation. For their part, many returnees saw themselves as culturally superior to the Russians in Russia, having dutifully kept the Russian flag flying in remote lands in Central Asia, for example, and now as helping to offset demographic decline in the Russian Federation. But without the support of existing kinship and other networks, they would have struggled even more. One 51-year-old returnee spoke in 1999 of not waiting for the state to intervene. He said, if we waited, we would die like mammoths. We would become extinct. And she prided herself on having established a new community, a new association, an община, the Russian word for commune or community. Although some returnees saw themselves as Russian citizens with the proper documents, rather than as refugees, on a day-to-day level, the evidence suggested a difficult accommodation between newcomers and their neighbors, at least as great as it had been with the repatriations that took place after the two world wars. What's certain is that they were expected to adapt to the new realities with little tangible official support. Immigrants, as one put it, immigrants within our own country. It seems somehow appropriate that some of them ended up in the remote forests of Chernobyl, where, as one repatriate put it, we lost two motherlands at once, Tajikistan and the Soviet Union. That sense of loss was enduring and difficult to remedy. It's a telling reminder that repatriation and return rarely produce the kind of closure that institutional proponents assume to be part of the outcome. Meanwhile, there's also now a suggestion that non-Russians living in the Russian Federation, see themselves not only as second-class citizens, but as cannon fodder for Putin's war. At another European extremity, recent developments indicate how another supposedly peripheral site can suddenly acquire political salience, with migration as the battleground. I'm referring to Ceuta, C-E-U-T-A, one of two Spanish enclaves in North Africa adjacent to Morocco. Ceuta garnered international attention during the 1990s following Spain's accession to the European Union. This recast the EU's external borders. One direct outcome was the construction of a high security fence in 1993, financed by the European Union, a symbolic and a material manifestation of the wish to keep Europe and Africa apart. Ceuta then returned to the spotlight in 2015, when the Spanish authorities created a so-called system of border surveillance to deter migrants from the Sahel. These measures were a response to the decision by Morocco to relax its controls on entry to the enclave as a tit-for-tat response to Spain's decision to allow a Western Saharan independence leader to travel to Madrid for emergency medical treatment. It's a further reminder that migration policy cannot be separated from the history of colonial rule and post-colonial territorial and political claims. Looking at migration at more of a micro level can tell us a lot about developments at the macro level. And far from being marginal or peripheral, developments in Ceuta point to some of the big issues in migration policy. The investment of resources and effort in policing the borders between states, the legacies of colonialism, the ways in which migration can become a political weapon, and last but not least, the atrocious conditions in which many migrants are held. Allow me a brief reference to the Iberian Peninsula itself. In a wide-ranging article significantly titled "Comparing Migrations at the Margins of Europe," anthropologist Michaela Rogozin-Soltar traces the post-war history of Andalusia as a region of mass emigration from the 1940s through the 1970s, showing then how it became a region of return migration, and more recently the destination of undocumented migrants arriving from North Africa. In addition to her careful treatment of migrants' perspectives, she pinpoints the discursive representation of Andalusia as historically backward, whereas Europe beyond the Pyrenees was regarded as the site of economic opportunity, as well as exposing migrants to capitalist exploitation. In an important concluding observation, she writes, quote, "The question of what migration portends for European cohesion, for the perceived boundaries of European cultural identity, and for the stakes of European belonging, goes far beyond the influx of migrants to Europe from elsewhere." And by incorporating continental, national, regional, and local historical dimensions as a way of thinking multiple mobilities, changing migration policies, economic transformation, and cultural representations, it seems to me that she has provided a model of good practice for historians of European migration. Now, the history of migration in and to Europe is connected not only to mobility and resettlement, but also to immobility and confinement. Both mobility and immobility draw attention to the peripheralization of places and people. I want to refer to an article in Slavic Review from 2017 by a scholar, Dace Janowska, who described a meeting with Yuri. Yuri was a Latvian who had settled in Lincolnshire, England, one of the most deprived parts of the country. Yuri recounted a casual and not unfriendly conversation an Englishwoman struck up with him and his friend in a local pub. Being told of their Latvian connections, she congratulated them on their grasp of English, before adding, "You can pick up and leave. Go back to your country if things here are not so good. But we don't have anywhere else to go." Notwithstanding her casual assumption that Yuri had such a choice and was willing to exercise it, her remark about the different dimensions of confinement is very revealing about the impact of sustained austerity and structural inequality on social attitudes. It's as if the Englishwoman felt forgotten, made to be peripheral, socially excluded, and in brackets equals Brexit. But what of Yuri and fellow migrants from New Europe? Presumably, following Latvia's accession to the EU in May 2004, he was pleased to take advantage of freedom of movement and the opportunities to send some of his wages to family members in Latvia, unlike a previous generation of Latvians who were recruited as European volunteer workers in the aftermath of World War II, and who did equally backbreaking work for low wages without being able to send remittances to what had become Soviet Latvia. Did Yuri think of himself as free to come and go, as the Englishwoman assumed, or did he feel trapped? Perhaps he belonged to the large contingent of migrants from former Soviet bloc countries who thought of themselves as coming from the European periphery and who might not fit in, but who nevertheless drew a clear distinction between themselves as white, albeit non-hegemonic, migrants, and non-white workers and migrants, many of whom, after all, had lived in the UK for generations. Recent ethnography suggests that migrants from the ex-Soviet bloc distinguished themselves as subscribing to European values from migrants coming from the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. I don't know what Yuri thought, but it's a reminder that peripheries and peripheralization might be mutable as a result of geopolitical change, yet are also liable to be fixed by racialized hierarchies. Returning to Ukraine, the exodus of refugees in 2002 was also racialized. Setting aside the terrible characterization by Putin's entourage and the Wagner mercenaries of Ukrainians, quote, as subhuman orcs. It's also troubling to realize how readily Ukraine's neighbors and many Western governments immediately made provision for Ukrainians who fled. Significantly, non-Ukrainian people, including Indian and Nigerian students, reported a hostile reception at the hands of both Ukrainian and Polish officials. And maybe something else is going on here. The transformation of Ukraine from the periphery to the center of attention in Western European corridors of power and the media, the suggestion that Ukraine is embarked on a life and death struggle to break free of Russia's grip, has not been accompanied by a corresponding outpouring of support on the part of countries in the global south, which contrasts the relative treatment by Western governments of Ukrainian refugees on the one hand, with the treatment of refugees from war-torn countries in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, who gain neither admission nor benefit from corresponding material aid. Is it also possible to detect here a memory in the global south of Soviet Russia's support for national liberation movements and a willingness to reciprocate by supporting Russia, or at least not castigating its intervention in Ukraine? So where is Europe, and who gets to decide where and what it is, and where and what it is to be European? There's a nice line from Hungarian author, the late Péter Eszterházy, quote, Once I was an Eastern European. Then I was promoted to the rank of Central European. Then a few months ago, I became a New European. But before I had the chance to get used to this status, even before I could have refused it, I have now become a non-core European. It's a witty rumination on Europeanness in the wake of the Cold War. But Esterhazy could afford to be playful. A migrant or refugee from the global south has no such opportunity. Their identity is fixed by the legacies of colonial rule and decolonization. Either they are excluded, or they face discrimination if they somehow manage to surmount the barriers to entry. But their agency, their consciousness, their resistance, as well as that of their predecessors, is something that must be the subject of another paper. Thank you.
I'm going to point out names, so be sure to speak into the microphone, okay, for a question and answer, but I'm sure we have lots of questions and answers. Please be sure to grab a microphone.
Thank you so much. Hi, back here.
Oh,
hi. Sorry. Thank you so much. That was very thoughtful, and thank you as well for your work. So I have two quick questions, if I may. The first is, throughout your talk, I was thinking a lot of the argument of Tendai Achime on migration as decolonization, which, among other things, is suggesting that because the European colonial project required, emigration from Europe to what is now considered the global South, Europe therefore has a sort of obligation, if you will, to accept migrants from these former colonized territories. And so I was curious your thoughts about that argument. And then secondly, I was curious your thoughts about the role. So you sort of use the, just look at my notes, when you sort of use the example of Ukraine as a way to think about this continual unsettling of Europe, I was curious about how you see the role of white supremacy within that. Thank you.
The question of obligation is a very, very important one, and I'm not sure I can do justice in a kind of improvised answer, which is what it must be. It seems to me that it could be argued that there are two kinds of obligation. There is, as it were, an obligation that I talked about, which is the obligation to those who, as it were, with the embodiment of the imperial idea or the colonial presence in outside Europe, and who were, as it were, defending the colonial project until such time as their position became untenable, and it became untenable, as I would argue, because of resistance and freedom fighting. But that obligation, as it were, to accept their return was itself fraught with all sorts of difficulties and pain. And what I've tried to suggest is that there is a story to be told about which the obligation was how to say, acknowledged in a very half-hearted and reluctant way, partly, if I can put it in this rather glib way, because their presence was a reminder of defeat. As far as the obligation to others are concerned, to people who were not the embodiment of the colonial presence, but were the subjects of colonial rule, I mean, there's a massive story to be told here, in which one difficult and indeed lamentable episode manifested itself, as it were, prior to decolonization in the UK sphere. I suppose I'm thinking most obviously, not so much of people of colour who fought for the British Empire during the two world wars, but of those who came to the UK after the Second World War and the Windrush generation. Well, is there an obligation? Well, in a sense, the obligation was extended by the British to nationals who had the right of settlement until it was abrogated in the 1960s and further in the 1970s. And of course, that sense of obligation has been brutally, as it were, denied through all sorts of measures that require UK citizens to have all sorts of paperwork, like, employment slips and other documentary records, month by month, year by year, going back to, the 1940s, the 1950s, to demonstrate that they have citizenship rights. I mean, so that's a kind of way in which what one might think of as obligations have been, well, I don't know whether you'd say casually cast aside or deliberately so. And the idea of a deliberate casting aside of responsibilities or obligations, I think takes me into the second part of your question about white supremacy. And I find it quite difficult to talk about this because I'm speaking as a white person. But that insidious current and set of attitudes has, in my view, it's a personal view, has threaded its way through public opinion, consciousness, in all sorts of different routes and expressions, to the extent that it's become kind of, for many people, second nature. I'm not talking about people who dress up and hold up placards saying white lives matter, or are on the street saying Britain first. We can probably regard that as a minority, albeit a significant minority. I'm talking about the people I grew up with. I'm talking about family members in my sort of circle, for whom they wouldn't think of white supremacy as an issue because it was just, we are white, and so you didn't have to look for overt expressions of racism because the assumption was so deeply ingrained, and that is what I think has to be addressed. And in the UK, attempts to address it can be savagely suppressed. So there's repression and there's also a suppression because, as many people will know, attempts to tell a history of the UK in other modes immediately generates a huge resistance, a huge backlash. So I feel uncomfortable about responding to such an important and powerful question with just a few off-the-cuff remarks, but I think it's important to recognize that the sense of privilege and power that goes with whiteness, particularly in the UK, is something that can only benefit from being exposed, but the very process of exposure brings with it a good deal of countervailing pressure and not just disagreement, but a kind of violence.
My question has to do with
Sorry, what?
the Ukraine and the
Oh, yeah.
those that claim to be members of the Greco-Catholic Church and who claim that their origin is in the baptism of the Kievan Rus in 988, long before Moscow even existed.
Mhm.
And so, why is it that we don't hear more about that claim, and instead we seem to flip it so that the Moscow and those who claim to be the third Rome at much later than 988, why it is all of a sudden that they seem to have the upper hand versus looking at this claim of those who claim to be Greco-Catholics from 988.
Well, I think there are two ways in which I would respond to that question. Thank you. One is to say that there is a focus, including a historiographical focus, that attends to, as it were, the long history of Ukraine. Kievan Rus and things that you talk about, the century, the millennium plus history of Ukraine, which has been actively fostered, discussed, written about, but has found it very difficult to escape, in my view, escape from the confines of a kind of diasporic historiography, of a historiography that's, if you like, owned by Ukrainian diaspora, whether it's in France or the United States or Canada or wherever it might be. And that parallel consciousness or historiographical awareness sits alongside what I called, I'm borrowing from the work of a historian called Mark von Hagen, who talks about historiographical amnesia. He wrote an article 20 or so years ago, Does Ukraine Have a History? Very nice piece of work, in which he said, and I plead guilty to this as well, in what I taught for a decade or more, that the history of Ukraine is subsumed within the history of Russia and the Soviet Union. You know, whether it's a history of industrialization, of Tsarist Russia, whether it's a history of Soviet rule after 1917, is something that was not allowed to have a kind of independent or autonomous existence within the historiographic mainstream, that it was kind of had to be subsumed within a kind of imperial or Soviet approach to the past.
See, there's where I think the history has to be rewritten and looked
Oh,
at
yeah.
carefully.
Yeah.
I would challenge that, which is a very plausible view that you've given about the being subsumed into the Russian history or the history of the Muscovy, but because we have to look and see how many Greco-Catholics are there now, not just in diaspora, who live right there in the Ukraine right now.
Yeah.
I think there's where
Okay.
the history has to be kind of opened up again.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm George Bernard, graduated from Notre Dame 57 years ago, live in South Bend. And a year or two before Hitler came to power in 1933, the Soviet Bolsheviks enacted a starvation program against Ukraine. And I'm wondering how many Ukrainians who could get out, even while their neighbors and relatives were starving and that were too weak to get out, went to places like Germany and told the stories of what was going on there, and could this have stimulated the German people to help elect Hitler to go against the Bolsheviks?
I'd be very doubtful about the capacity or the opportunities to tell that story as it happened, right? I mean, telling the story later is a different matter after the Second World War. But telling the story of the Holodomor in 1933, for example, I mean, people were essentially trapped. There was some exposure by one or two British travelers to Ukraine. You know, people who managed to circumvent restrictions on internal travel and were able to get out messages to the British Foreign Office, for example, about what was going on. But then there was a degree of reluctance to accept the story that they were being told. And of course, as you know, in America, it's well known that journalists like Walter Duranty were quite explicit that this is a concocted story. The only thing I would say here, so I'm treading on slightly controversial ground here, is that the policy of Stalin's collectivization has been argued by people like Robert Conquest and many others was a terror famine. In other words, that it was Stalin's attempt, it was a kind of genocidal campaign to neutralize Ukrainian nationalism. My own view is a kind of somewhat at odds with that, because I think Stalin was less interested in a Ukrainian genocide than he was in grain. And that's what drove collectivization, was getting grain, not killing Ukrainians. If they were, as it were, collateral damage, that's another matter. But getting grain meant getting it from the hands of whoever was holding it, whether they were Ukrainian peasants or Kazakh peasants or peasants of other ethnic affiliation. So I know that Ukrainians would kind of rise up against me and denounce my view, but I don't think it can solely be attributed to a Stalinist genocidal campaign. It was a campaign to extract grain, and whoever got in the way of that, whatever their ethnic background, that was curtains for them.
Thank you for the talk. I have two questions, so I'll ask the one about Ukraine first, and then the one that will let you not talk about Ukraine if you don't want to. So the first question would be this dynamic you allude to a few times in the talk about how Europe, core Europe, if we want to call it that, has been more welcoming to white refugees from Ukraine than to refugees from the global south, and as you note, than to African and Asian students who were in Ukraine at the time. I've had a lot of students ask me the question about why that dynamic exists over the past year, and I've always talked about like the racialization aspect, and I've also noted that international refugee law in some ways was constructed around the idea of the Soviet aggressor. And that I think that there's a way in which it's very legible within international refugee law that the Russian state now would be the aggressor again. And I'm just curious kind of what you think about that as somebody who is an expert on the history of refugee law really profoundly. And then I was also really struck by your remark at the beginning that the unsettling of Europe came initially from Penguin's proposal that you write a book about migration to Britain. And you said, no, I'm going to title the British chapter the peripheral chapter, and I'm going to insist on narrating the story in a European frame. And my question there is, in moving from the national frame to the European frame, what do you think are the best, what do you think that shift in scale highlights, and what are the benefits of that approach? And then do you think you lost anything in the move from a national to a European frame? Were there any specific pitfalls that you experienced in writing the book? And I love the book, but I want to hear your thoughts.
What did I lose? By not foregrounding the UK, I lost the positive reviews from people whose names may or may not mean anything in this room. There's a guy called David Goodhart, who's a political commentator, who regards himself as a progressive person who's written books essentially about the need to preserve a kind of core British identity, Britain under threat. I mean, it's not overt, but it's about communities that he grew up in, actually that I grew up in, which have changed over time. And isn't that terrible? And I was trying to say, but actually, my book is not about what's happened in Brixton, in London, or Liverpool. In recent years, if I wrote a book about British immigration, it would be about the long history of presence of people of colour in the UK. Not about this as a sudden kind of invasion. In a sense, but I don't think, Lauren, it's a book that's partly about the continent, but it also preserves a national focus at the same time, because I did want to talk about Poland, I did want to talk about Germany, France, and other countries with a kind of national focus, and I also wanted to make the point that if we're talking about migration and Europe, we've got to allow for the possibility that a great deal of the history is about country migration rather than crossing frontiers. But I also wanted to try and capture the sense that there is a European dimension to this as well. The thing I think I regret is not that I didn't talk about the impact of migration. People like David Goodhart wanted me to say, what's going on with the white British in Birmingham? That's not. I'm more interested in what's going on in the minds and the motives and the experiences of people who migrate. That otherwise it would be a different book. Yes. What I regretted most, I think, is that although I do mention beyond Europe and migration, there's a lot to be said about migration from China to Western Europe, for example. I didn't hardly mention that at all. An Italian friend of mine picked me up on that. But the book is already big, and I was told to make it shorter. So that is a kind of response I'd make. The other question you ask about international refugee law, I mean, this is really such an important question. I'm giving a lecture in a few days' time at Wisconsin called Russia and Its Refugees, a 20th Century History. And one of the things I argue in that talk is that Russia was pretty foundational to the crystallization of international refugee law, both in the 1920s through the League of Nations refugee regime and after the Second World War. Not because the Soviet Union participated in framing the 1951 Refugee Convention. It didn't. It regarded it as a betrayal. But because the whole purpose, as you indicate, behind the convention was the idea of offering protection to a refugee, an individual who had a well-founded fear of persecution. And that persecution was understood essentially as totalitarian. It was understood as totalitarian in the sense that, well, we've got the legacy of the Second World War of the persecution that Hitler inflicted. And to some extent, Mussolini and Franco, but mainly Hitler persecution. But easily, as it were, transmuted, if that's the right phrase or word, into an insistence that freedom from persecution meant freedom from Soviet persecution. and then a lot of interesting work is now being done about the extent to which those who drafted the convention anticipated or allowed for a conception that provided for events outside Europe, because the convention says, you know, events in Europe, people who crossed frontiers owing to events in Europe before the 1st of January 1951. Okay, so the question then begins, what is the room for maneuver by considering refugees who are non-European and refugees who don't fit to that time frame? And of course, one of the things that changed was Hungarian Revolution in 1956, and UNHCR said, these are refugees. You know, did it happen before 1951? Yes. 1956 is after 1951. But why are Hungarian refugees in flight? Because Hungary went communist before 1951. So it became kind of a way of finessing. I thought that was a really interesting moment.
Very interesting lecture on your part. Thank you very much. Recently, and somewhat superficially, or in fact, rather superficially, the thoughts of Douglas Murray have come to my attention.
Really?
A name that you're no doubt familiar with. Now, he seems to view the immigration that's occurred over the past few years, and the possibility of this continuing is a real disaster for Europe that'll change Europe fundamentally so that Europe won't be Europe anymore. In particular, he points out the following statistic. In Austria, over the next X years, X being a reasonably small number, there will be more Muslims under the age of 15 living in Austria than Christian or nominally Christian 15-year-olds and less living in Austria. And so my question is, what do you think about this scenario that he paints out? And you know it much better than I do. And yeah, that's my question. What is your assessment of the arguments of Douglas Murray in this regard?
Well, your question begins by saying that Douglas Murray argues that migration on the scale that's taken place and may take place in the future is a disaster for Europe. I would say that Douglas Murray is a disaster. And I say this in all seriousness, because people who argue like Douglas Murray, and there's a tradition, you know, you can go back to what's the name? Raspail, is that, have I got the name wrong? The guy who wrote the book Le Camp des Saints, the Camp of Saints. Yeah, Jean Raspail, yeah. Same kind of tone adopted in this about the apocalypse. So there's a sense, it's a recycling those ideas from the 1960s, and I mean, people will know better than me how, you know, the late 19th, early 20th century generated and disseminated similar sorts of ideas about an apocalypse. My own view, and I say this again, going back to the answer I gave to Jean at the beginning, is that I know where he's coming from, because some of the people I grew up with and family members would have adopted the same sort of views or espoused the same sort of views. And it always seems to me that why do people like Murray look at this through a particular kind of lens when they could look at it through an entirely different lens? And instead of banging on about numbers and religion and race, they could say to themselves, is there a demographic issue in parts of Europe where an infusion of new people is badly needed to revive moribund villages or towns, but they don't do that. Or they could say the responsibility lies with the state or with governments to invest, to invest in the infrastructure, to invest in the houses, to invest in the health system, to invest in education, which would mean that people who feel threatened by the presence of outsiders begin to realize, A, that outsiders have something to offer, though it shouldn't be a question of what do they contribute, but that they do have something to offer, and B, that we should be blaming the government not for policies of kind of open door, which don't, what open door, but instead for policies that fail to keep up with the need to satisfy the requirements of all people for decent schools, decent housing, decent homes and so forth. But you won't find Murray talking about complaining about the government's refusal to spend money because it suits their agenda to divert attention onto migrants. That's my feeling. Why are we not talking about the failure of the British government for the last 10 or 20 years to invest? If the British government were to invest in services, how much better everyone would be. It's my personal view.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you a question or a version of a question that you posed yourself to the last panel, and that's about what this methodology will look like in the future. So, one of the big contributions of the Unsettling of Europe is how you uncover these voices in these very creative and groundbreaking ways, and the way that you look at your sources. In 40 years' time, if someone wants to write a history of the current migratory patterns and the experience of migrants on their journeys when they arrive in the country that they will settle in, how is that historian or that scholar going to do that? What sorts of sources can they use, do you think?
Thank you. I suspect there will be so much to draw upon. Whether we think about official records or the records of NGOs, but I'm thinking, I was talking to people over coffee about the power of ethnography and the way in which oral history, for example, has really transformed the field over the last 3 or 4 decades at least. And that oral history is not going to evaporate, and the methods of oral history are not going to be lost. But the specific question about voices, I spent a lot of time recently thinking about this. And if I could just digress slightly. The UNHCR holds millions of records which are partly about decisions that are reached by its officers in the field or in Geneva, but in the process of being required to reach a decision, that generates masses of pieces of personal testimony. I know for a fact that UNHCR Geneva is completely inundated with material on the wars in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. I mean, there's just car parks full, as it were, of documents. But what I find very exciting is that if you want to tell the story, that sounds a bit kind of tell the story. Okay, if you want to write about refugees in the 1950s through the 1970s, there are thousands of case files that UNHCR holds, which it's not making publicly available to people, at least not yet, but which I've been given access to. And these are remarkable because you hear people wanting to make themselves heard in front of an official, writing about their experiences. Now, of course, it might be Russians in the 1960s or 70s in China who've been there since 1917 or the 1920s, who are now elderly saying, I want to live in France for the rest of my days. But they're telling a story about the 20th century of Russia. Or they might be Hungarians who are telling a story about Hungary since the Second World War. And then there are students increasingly from countries in sub-Saharan Africa who are writing in the 1960s, sometimes because they have been victimized by post-colonial states, or their families have been persecuted, or they are part of freedom struggles and are outside their country of origin because they want to fight the Portuguese rather than live in Angola or Mozambique, and the spectrum of voices and the fact that you can hear people, as it were, writing, petitioning UNHCR. And a back and forth very often, because they might write one letter and the letter's kind of sent back with a kind of formulaic reply. They start again, and that sense of refugees who won't take no for an answer is part of what's the kind of intrusive pleasure of doing research. And then you get utopian visions. You get refugees saying, why can't there be a united world? Why can't there be a world without borders? Why can't there be a world without refugees? Or people who come up with their own plans. So you've got refugees who are not just, as it were, alluding to their own circumstances, help me, but who are saying, we can do things better than this. Absolutely fascinating material. So I suspect that kind of stuff, it exists in the IRO, the International Refugee Organization archives as well. There's a great book by Ruth Ballint who's used that material quite recently. And yeah, so I think the kind of, I'm a great believer in refugee history, and I think that field is starting to be transformed as people realize that there is stuff. There is stuff. It's just that we haven't necessarily asked the questions or gone looking for it. And it's not just bureaucratic stuff. It's about real lives.
Time for one more question.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was hoping to invite you to return back to the subject of civility that you mentioned earlier on.
Of what, sorry?
Civility
Yeah.
and perceptions of civility. And a question that was previously posed to you brought in the element, or a few, brought in the element of whiteness. So when I think about civility, I also think about how it's racialized and how it is perceived and also like culturally reinforced in a way that has real consequences, and which groups, which migrants are being granted accessibility to the West and to Europe. And I was thinking about, or I've been contemplating what some of the fears are, right? And if those fears are really rooted in cultural transfer or fears of cultural loss, and how that relates to perceptions of civility, particularly in its connection to being synonymous or used in connection with whiteness being the perception of the norm, and what one, right? So in terms of like Europe, what one should be striving for to be successfully accepted into the European model, which is fundamentally problematic to say. And I've been thinking about some of the conversations that have been taking place in the past 15, I'm just going to speak to the past 15 years because that's what I'm more familiar with, where the goal has been often packaged as being striving for tolerance, which to me is a pretty low bar. And I'm wondering why not something that you mentioned. Why is there a lack of appreciation of difference, and how that can be presented as a different expression of civility? And so I'm wondering, what connections have you, or what connections have you encountered in your research that has to do with how civility is curated, and also how it's policed in terms of its gatekeeping, and how that relates to the actual gatekeeping of borders, right? And who is granted access to Europe and who is not.
Wow.
To end on a light note,
Yeah. I don't have an answer that would do justice to the power of your question, but I'm obliged to stand here and try and say something, you know, reasonably coherent. What I would say is that we can look at your question on a kind of grand scale, whether it's national or Europe, at a European level. And we're then confronted by precisely the sorts of challenges and odious manifestations that are encouraged by the work of people like Douglas Murray. But when I began by talking about optimism and pessimism, without in any way disregarding or minimizing precisely the kinds of racist production and description that has become all too apparent, but not necessarily new, but nevertheless apparent. We could at the same time allow for the possibility of, if you like, not I don't say tolerance, but a kind of acceptance and accommodation as a starting point for something that would go beyond that to something much more meaningful and much more positive, in the sense that, particularly at a local level, I'm afraid I'm talking really about a UK perspective, but at a local level, alongside the racist overtures and campaigning and so forth, there is a corresponding action, lobby, if you like, which is driven by a recognition that we can not only live together, but learn from each other and thrive by interaction rather than, as it were, living hermetically apart. And I think when you raise the question about culture and loss, we can also twist this or turn this in the other direction and think about cultural gain, because again, in the UK, if you think of cultural life, you know, maybe when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, and you think of the kind of cultural just richness that's been the product of non-white presences in the UK, I mean, the kind of extraordinary difference it makes in terms of just, you know, the quality of life, whether we're talking about theatre or music or literature, you know, and I think people are ready to embrace that, and if people can embrace that alongside the kind of economic imperatives that are necessary, then I think there is potential to ground things on a more decent kind of level of civility than what we have found in the last 20 or 30 years. I feel bad about answering the last question and an important question in such a kind of feeble way, but I suppose I am thinking, I am trying to hold on to notions of a world which we create. The world isn't given. That it requires effort, but your effort and my effort, and indeed the efforts of scholars.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Peter Gatrell.